3 p.m. Colonialism was originally associated with settlement by foreigners, that is, converting a newfound land into a colony. These foreign settlers established their domination and exploited indigenous people in the economic, political, and cultural domains. Colonialism implies the domination of economic, political, social, and cultural by foreigners of indigenous people. Foreigners may be in form of foreign settlers, businesses, and foreign states or foreign institutions. For example, post-decolonization, after WW2, neocolonialism began. Ex-colonies now had political independence legally, but they were still dominated and exploited by ex-colonial powers and international institutions like IMF and the World Banks. As these newly independent nations were economically weak and therefore dependent on foreign aid and loans, which were tied with conditionalities that prevented these nations from following independent policies, therefore this was colonialism in a new form, hence the name neocolonialism. Imperialism is when there is the use of the military or its threat. In imperialism, there is usually a loss of sovereignty and is usually done by a foreign state, therefore empire building via territorial annexations is a feature of imperialism usually. Colonialism and imperialism are used interchangeably. Old colonialism imperialism existed pre-industrialization of Western Europe, that is pre-1870. Pre-1817, it was motivated by gold, glory, and God. God represented the motive of spreading Christianity. Glory represented empire building. Gold represented economic motives and led to economic exploitation via loot of wealth and resources, plantation systems, trade of lucrative crops from the colony to the rest of the world, and the lucrative slave trade, where Africans were sold as slaves in the Americas for cheap labor in the plantation system. The topic of the next class, Advent of Europeans. Modern Indian History Class 09. Last class revision, 5:01 p.m. Advent of European, 5:15 p.m. Traditionally, European trade with the East was done via the Silk Route, a land route to China, and a spice route, a sea route to the East. Traders from Venice and Geneva dominated European trade with the East and earned huge profits by selling to the rest of Europe. Urban sea part of the trade was dominated by Arab traders. In 1453, Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople and locked European trade with the East, triggering a search for a northwest trade route to the East. This led to the Age of Discovery in the 16th century, whereby man of the world was gradually developed and there were advances in shipping and knowledge of geography. In 1492, Columbus discovered Central America. In 1498, Vasco da Gama discovered a route via the Cape of Good Hope to India and reached Calicut. In 1500, Amerigo Vespucci discovered South America and proved that America was a continent different from India. In the early 16th century, the Portuguese discovered a new route to China and the Philippines. Therefore, European trade with the East was established. Portuguese in India, 5:50 p.m. Trade with India was done via a state-led corporation. They began their trade with South India and set up trading centers in different parts of India, especially coastal areas. They set up their main base in and around Surat and later in Goa. In 1510, they captured Goa from the Kingdom of Bijapur and Bombay in 1534. They dominated international trade in the East Indies for 100 years with HQ in Goa. Since India had strong land power, therefore Portuguese followed the policy of domination only of the high seas oceans and the oceanic trade of India. They did not aim to build a political empire in India. Portuguese dominated the high seas, dual water policy, as they were strong naval powers. They did armed trade, engaged in piracy, and therefore the passage via oceans and allowed passage only after payment of a license fee by other ships. They regularly raided Arab traders who until now dominated Arabian Sea trade and also threatened Mughal ships, forcing Mughals to give trade concessions from lower customs duties and permission to set up factories and trading centers. They were religious fanatics and engaged in forced conversions to Christianity. In the late 16th century, there was the rise of two new naval powers, Dutch and England. The first challenge to achieving freedom was navigation in the ocean and the second to removing Portuguese control over the oceanic trade of the East Indies. In 1588, in a decisive battle, Britain defeated Armada, a large Spanish naval fleet in the Atlantic Ocean, and now Britain and the Dutch could travel to the east via the Cape of Good Hope. British versus Portuguese, 6:39 p.m. In 1608, EIC wanted to open a factory in Surat, therefore sending Captain Hawkins to Jahangir's court. He was given a mansab and a jagir but then was removed from court due to pressure from the Portuguese. Therefore, EIC realized that the military defeat of the Portuguese is a must for EIC to expand its trade with India. In 1612, EIC defeated the Portuguese navy in Surat and therefore was rewarded by Jahangir with a royal famine in 1612, which gave EIC the right to establish itself on the west coast. Hence, Surat factory was set up in 1612. To extract more concession, British government sent Thomas Roe as an ambassador, and he was accepted as a resident in Jahangir's court. Finally, in 1617, he was able to extract another royal famine where the British got the right to establish factories in the whole of the Mughal Empire and liberal trading rights. These angered the Portuguese, and in 1620 conflicts culminated in a major battle where the British won, and this ended Portuguese domination of international trade in India. In 1661, King Charles II of England got the island of Bombay in dowry from the Portuguese. Therefore, by the mid-17th century, the Portuguese were restricted to Goa, Daman and Diu, Dadra, and Nagar Haveli. British versus Dutch, 7:09 p.m. Dutch removed the Portuguese from Ceylon and the East Indies, Indonesia. And now rivalry between the British and the Dutch who fought for decades, and finally by the mid-17th century British was defeated and a compromise was reached whereby the Dutch agreed to not attack the British in India and the British left Indonesia to the Dutch. British stayed in Malaya and Dutch dominated Cochin by 1669. The Dutch were removed from Cochin in 1741 by Marthanda Varma. By 1795, the complete removal of the Dutch from India by British. English East India Company, 7:28 p.m. It was set up on 31st December 1600 by a royal charter, which was its founding document issued by Queen Elizabeth. The tools given by royal charter to EIC were monopoly over British trade with the East Indies, that is with all land east of Cape of Good Hope for 15 years. EIC was allowed to carry gold out of Britain to buy Eastern goods. The right to wage war, acquire territories, and administer them. The goal for EIC formation as per the charter was not empire building but trade with the East to counter Dutch competition. Presidencies of EIC. Presidencies of EIC in Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta served as regional HQ of EIC trade with South, West, and East India respectively. The term presidency was given or the status of HQ was given when these places came to have significant EIC establishments in form of warehouse, offices, homes, etc. Later, when EIC annexed territories in India, they were added to respectively regional presidencies, leading to the expansion of the company's regional HQ into provinces of British India. The Madras Presidency was set up in 1652. The Bombay Presidency was set up in 1681. The Calcutta Presidency was set up in 1699. The governor of the presidency was a regional manager of EIC, who initially looked mainly after the business of EIC, but once EIC became conqueror and ruler, then ruling parts of India became his additional responsibility as the company transformed itself into a company state. The topic of the next, Rise of EIC as Political Power. Modern Indian History Class 10. Rise of English East India Company as Political Power, 5:05 p.m. Was the conquest of India a result of British policy? British arguments. Britain has no such policy, and the conquest of India was the product of sub-imperialism, which are the result of policies and actions and personal ambitions of senior officials of EIC like Robert Clive, Governor of Calcutta Presidency, Richard Wellesley, Governor-General of Bengal from 1798 to 1805, Hastings, Governor-General of Bengal, 1813-23, Dalhousie, Governor-General of India, 1848 to 1956. They had personal ambitions for British polity and a personal desire for empire building. Many senior EIC officials build good political careers after they retire from EIC. For example, Wellesley became Secretary of State, a cabinet member. In the Pitt's India Act of 1784, there was a parliamentary prohibition on conquest in India. The goal behind the Royal Charter of 1600 was trade and not empire building. Indian arguments. Yes, there was sub-imperialism in India. However, the British state cannot escape responsibility for imperialism in India as a tool of conquest to EIC by the state as a charter of EIC that was a founding document issued by the state, initially by the Crown and later by Parliament. It gave power to EIC to wage war, sign treaties, acquire territory, and administer them. EIC had the military support of the Royal Military in its military conflicts, and without the Royal Military, EIC could not have begun the conquest of India. Battle of Plassey 1757. Even the 1857 revolt was crushed with the help of the Royal Military. The state assisted EIC in setting up and developing EIC presidencies. For example, Bombay was given an annual rent of just £10 to EIC by the Crown. Therefore, state helped EIC set up a strong base in India, leading to higher profits via trade that led to the capability of EIC to have its big army. British Crown, state, and important figures in British polity benefited monetarily from EIC trade and conquest. For example, £17,000 were given by EIC to the Crown monarchy in the 17th century in return for the renewal of charters. In 1698, Parliament auctioned the monopoly of British trade with East the New Company as it offered a £2 million loan versus £700,000 offered by EIC. In 1709, EIC and New Company merged. In 1767, EIC was mandated by Parliament state to pay £400,000 annum to the state. Therefore, state wanted its share of EIC loot of Bengal after the Battle of Plassey in 1757 and the Battle of Buxar in 1764. Important figures were shareholders of EIC, for example, many parliamentarians and Queen Elizabeth herself. EIC became an important tool of the foreign policy of Britain as EIC dominated international trade in Britain. After the Regulation Act of 1773 and the Pitt's India Act of 1784, EIC affairs in India came under the supervision and control of the British state, and the Board of Control could pass binding orders to EIC. Now the principal servants of EIC in India could only be appointed after the approval of the Crown. Therefore, even if imperialism was not possible for the British state, an opportunity made use of and even created by important EIC officials in India, that is sub-imperialism, the British state cannot escape responsibility for imperialism in India. Events in empire building by EIC, 7:11 p.m. EIC versus Aurangzeb, 1686. EIC attacked the Mughals in Bengal as Aurangzeb's constant warfare hurt the overland trade, therefore hurting EIC's oceanic trade. EIC was crushed but then forgiven in return for 1.5 lakh rupees compensation as Mughals got revenue from EIC in form of customs duties and from Indian merchants who sold goods to EIC in form of domestic taxes. Indian merchants got business from EIC. The inflow of gold due to EIC exports from India. Indian peasants and artisans benefited as EIC trade generated demands for their goods. In fact, in 1691, Aurangzeb issued a royal farman that gave EIC the right to duty-free trade in return for just 3,000 rupees annum. Role of Britain-France rivalry. Role of Britain-France rivalry. Three Carnatic Wars, 1746 to 1948, 1749 to 1954, and 1756 to 1963. Battle of Plassey. Fourth Anglo-Mysore War, 1799. First Carnatic War, 1746 to 1948, 7:50 p.m. It was part of and the result of the Austrian War of Succession in 1740 to 1948, where Britain and France with their allies fought in Europe, the Americas, and India. Dupleix was governor of the French EIC in Pondicherry, the main base of French in India since 1664. He has personal ambitions of empire building and wanted the French EIC to dominate the international trade of South India. The conflict began in 1746 after capturing Fort St. George in Madras. Dupleix refused to hand it over as promised to Nawab of Carnatic. This led to the First Carnatic 1746 to 178 with Carnatic and British EIC versus French EIC. War was won by Dupleix, however. In North America, British were victorious, and for France, its American possession was more important. Therefore, under the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle 1748, France got back its possession in North America while the British got back Madras. Therefore, status quo was maintained. Now Dupleix searched for the next opportunity to increase French influence, and this led to the Second Carnatic War. The topic for the next class, Second Carnatic Wars. Modern Indian History Class 11. Last class revision, 5:02 p.m. First Carnatic War. It was part of and the result of the Austrian War of Succession. War was won by Dupleix, however, in North America British were victorious, and for France, its American possession was more important. Therefore, under the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle 1748, France regained its possession in North America while the British returned Madras. Second Carnatic War, 1749 to 1954, 5:15 p.m. Dupleix got an opportunity in the form of succession disputes in Hyderabad and Carnatic. In Hyderabad, Nasir Jung versus Muzaffar Jung, and Carnatic, Muhammad Ali versus Chanda Sahib. Dupleix supported Chanda Sahib and Muzaffar Jung as he wanted economic and political benefits after putting his choice of candidate in power. Therefore, anxious British EIC supported Muhammad Ali and Nasir Jung. Dupleix and Bassi won the first phase by 1751, while Robert Clive of British EIC won the second phase by 1754. After first phase, Muzaffar Jung was declared Nizam of Hyderabad and Chanda Sahib of Arcot, Carnatic. Muzaffar Jung was killed on his way from Carnatic to Hyderabad by Nawab of Kurnool, as he had supported Muzaffar Jung but now feared a breach of the promise of territory made by Muzaffar Jung. Now Bassi continued to march to Hyderabad and inflicted colossal terror. He put Salabat Jung in power in Hyderabad and placed a French military for the protection of Nizam. This military was to be paid for by Hyderabad. Therefore, French EIC got northern circles from Hyderabad. Other French gains after first phase. Bassi was stationed as a French agent in the Hyderabad court, establishing French political influence in Hyderabad, personal jagirs for Bassi, and £200,000 for French EIC. In Carnatic, huge Peronsal jagirs for Dupleix. Dupleix was declared as Nawab of all lands between River Krishna and Cape Comorin, with Chanda Sahib as Nawab of Arcot. After second phase victory by British, Dupleix was recalled by France in 1754 due to high war expenditure. Also, France wanted to honor the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle 1748 to secure its assets in America. Chanda Sahib surrendered but was still beheaded despite the promise of life by Robert Clive. France was allowed to retain territory around Pondicherry, its factors in Carnatic, northern circles, and French agent at Hyderabad court. Muhammad Ali became the Nawab of Carnatic. Therefore, French influence in Hyderabad and British influence in Carnatic was the net result of the Second Carnatic War. Third Carnatic War, 1756 to 1963, 6:22 p.m. Resultant part of a 7-year global war, 1756 to 1963, fought between Britain, France, and their respective allies. It was fought in Europe, Africa, the Americas, and India. Count Gilali arrived from France to lead the French military along with Bassi, who was in charge of northern circles, while Robert Clive played an essential role from the British side. The Royal Military of Britain and France arrived in India. Why did France lose? Tactical mistake. Bassi left northern circles unguarded to help Lali in Carnatic, leading to the loss of northern circles to the British. Poor leadership of Lali. He was hated among French officials and sepoys due to his rude conduct, which hurt the army's morale. The superior British Navy. The superior financial strength of Britain and British EIC while France faced financial difficulty. For example, French soldiers were unpaid for months, which hurt morale. Britain had witnessed growth earlier than France during the Industrial Revolution in Britain, with more significant trade profit as trading with more regions and longer time, whereas feudalism ended in France very late. The result of the war was the question of dominance over international trade in India was decided in the British favour. Most decided was the Battle of Vandivash, and the French lost all over, including Pondicherry. French lost all gains made since 1749 under Dupleix. Therefore, French were restricted to their bases. They were barred from fortifying their bases and from keeping a strong military. In 1769, French EIC was ended by France. French continued in Chandigarh and Pondicherry. The high number of British Royal Military troops arrived in India in favour of EIC, giving EIC the military advantage over Indian states. For example, they felt confident enough to start the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Long-term effects of Carnatic Wars. Post-1757, EIC began maintaining a large army with the help of the loot of Bengal. Now EIC began increasing its political influence and started empire building in 1757. In 1766, Hyderabad gave northern circles to EIC in return for military protection against Mysore and Marathas. In 1798, Hyderabad became the first state to sign a subsidiary alliance that brought military and foreign policy under EIC. The huge territory of Mysore was annexed by 1799 via the Third and Fourth Anglo-Mysore War and subsidiary alliance signed by Mysore in 1799. After the death of an ally, Muhammad Ali Carnatic was annexed in 1801. In 1805 subsidiary alliance was signed with Travancore. Peshwa signed a subsidiary alliance in 1803 to regain Peshwaship with British help. In the Second Anglo-Martha War, Marthas lost significant territory, and Scindia of Gwalior signed a subsidiary alliance. Therefore, EIC began political influence in South India with the Carnatic War and dominated South India politically by the early 19th century. Reaction